In War Thunder, we have access to a wide range of tanks from across a large swath of history, from the 1920s all the way to the modern day. However, there is one era that is completely unrepresented in War Thunder ground forces. That era is, of course, the First World War, with its only representation in the game so far being a few ships in the naval game mode. This means that War Thunder is missing a rather unique period in history, one which could give us a large number of rather interesting tanks and other vehicles. Of course, when discussing whether World War I tanks should be in War Thunder, the first obstacle that would need to be tackled is whether there would be much interest in World War I being represented in War Thunder. On the face of it, World War I does seem to be a lot less popular in video games. I mean, you just have to take a look at the list of World War I games versus the number of World War II games in existence. And you can see why it made sense for War Thunder to focus on World War II and the modern era. That said, when the World War I era is done right, it can prove to be a unique selling point and rather successful. For example, if you take a look at Battlefield 1, when it released in October 2016, it was the best-selling game in the US for that month. And then when it went up against Call of Duty Infinite Warfare a month later in November, it still managed a respectable second place. Even more impressive when you remember that game had a bundle version which came with the remastered Call of Duty 4. I know in my case I bought the bundle for that reason, happily playing the remastered game and never actually touched Infinite Warfare. So of course, with World War II and the modern era already being implemented in War Thunder, it makes sense for War Thunder to start making moves into the World War I period, an era where tanks don't really have a good representation in games, meaning Gaijin could quite easily corner this part of the market. So assuming Gaijin does decide to implement World War I tanks, how many and what sort of tanks could we reasonably expect? Well, surprisingly, there would be a large number of tanks, with my own list coming in at around 24 tanks, with this going up to around 43 when including armoured cars, truck-based artillery guns and SPAA vehicles, with all nations getting at least one tank, bar Israel. So let's take a quick look at what sort of tanks we could expect. Now, the tanks themselves would cover a wide range of roles and specialities, and some of these tanks will probably be familiar to players, such as the French FT-17, which was the world's first modern tank and thus looks much like a conventional tank already in the game. But France would have access to its earlier, less conventional World War I designs, like the Schneider CA-1 and the Saint-Chamond, with the former having its armament mounted on the right side of the tank, and the latter acting like an early tank destroyer with its nose-mounted gun, while also resembling a seesaw due to its overextended body. France would also have access to the FCM-1A heavy tank, which was a precursor to the Char 2C, and the FT-75BS, which was an early attempt at a self-propelled gun. Britain, meanwhile, would unfortunately be mainly focused around its heavy tanks, which are probably the tanks that most people are familiar with in World War I. They are the tanks that are generally associated with that war. And this starts with the Mark I and ends with the Mark VIII. Now, two of these tanks didn't actually go into production or were only armed with machine guns, but due to different variants of these tanks, Britain will have access to at least 6 different types of tanks and probably nearer to 8 or 9, as well as the gun carrier Mark I, which was the world's first self-propelled gun. Germany would unfortunately only have 2 homegrown tanks. They just didn't focus on tanks as much during World War I. And these would be the A7V heavy tank and the LK2 light tank, though they also used many captured Allied tanks, which could be used in the tech tree at a pinch if needed. It's a bit of a shame that they only have the 2 tanks, because their 120-ton K-Wagen super heavy tank was supposedly only a few weeks away from going into testing, though due to its almost completeness it could be included as a one-off vehicle in the same vein as the E100. Or maybe as an April Fool's joke vehicle. Italy would also only get 2 tanks, one of these being the Fiat 3000, which was an Italian-made FT-17, but they also get the Fiat 2000, the only super heavy tank to go into service in World War I. Though it didn't see combat during that war, though it may have seen some combat in Libya in the interwar period. Russia would in practice only get 1 tank, again an FT-17, But they did also produce what I consider the most unique tank of World War I, the Tsar tank, which seems to have taken more inspiration from a penny farthing bicycle more than anything else. Unfortunately, only the one prototype was actually constructed, but again, like with the German K-Wagen, it could be considered for inclusion as a joke or one-off vehicle, again perhaps as an April Fool's joke event. Japan and Sweden would only get one tank each, with Japan getting the FT Co, which is basically a French FT-17, and Sweden the Stridsvagn M21-29, which was essentially a German Lk2 light tank built and modified in the interwar period. Lastly, America would get the Mark 8, which was a tank developed jointly with Britain, the M1917 light tank, which was an American-built variant of the French FT-17, and the Holt gas-electric tank, which was a design by the Holt Manufacturing Company and General Electric, though this didn't actually go into service. So as you can see, we have a large and varied number of designs. Bearing in mind we haven't really touched on the various armoured cars and truck-based vehicles, which would also be good additions to the game. In addition, by adding World War I tanks to War Thunder, we could also see some more interwar tanks being added to the game, with various designs like the British Vickers medium tank, American M1921 medium tank, the German Gross Traktor, and many more being available for implemented in War Thunder, with my own count giving us an extra 22 interwar tanks, or 29 if including armoured cars and truck-based vehicles. Totaling up the numbers from both eras gives us a total number of 46 World War I and interwar tanks, or 72 of all types of vehicles, which essentially would be giving us an entirely new tech tree worth of vehicles. Of course, we now have to discuss how to add to these tanks, as stats-wise they would be inferior to the current Tier 1 tanks. I personally would like to see the addition of a new Tier 0, starting from a battle rating of 0.0, with new players having the choice of whether they would like to start at Tier 0 or start from Tier 1 as is already the case. In the event that it's not possible to add them in this manner, then the next simplest option would be to move all current vehicles up a tier, with battle ratings also changing to accommodate the new vehicles. Though again, I would make the World War I tanks an optional starting point if possible. With regards to the battle ratings, I suspect many of these tanks would be placed rather low in the battle ratings, but the more capable among them could still face the current Tier 1 tanks, which would help to shake up the lower tier matches. So, having discussed why and how I think these tanks should be added to War Thunder, we now have to discuss some of the drawbacks to introducing World War I tanks. One drawback I could see being mentioned is their thinner armour and less effective guns, but as all of the early tanks will suffer from this issue, that problem would be somewhat balanced out and I think is a bit of a non-issue. However, one huge issue that nearly all World War I tanks would share is their speed, or lack of it, with the average speed of the tanks I've talked about coming in at around 5.8 miles per hour or 9.3 kilometers an hour. For comparison, the slowest vehicle in the game currently is the T-95 tank destroyer, with a top speed of 8 miles per hour or 13 kilometers an hour. I believe the best way to manage this problem would be to design World War I specific maps, where they could be made smaller than regular maps, lessening the distance needed to be travelled, thus negating the lack of speed. Additionally, trenches and muddy shell-covered terrain could also be used, allowing the large, slow World War I tanks the ability to operate in terrain they actually would have operated in during World War I, though this inclusion is more of an optional extra. These maps would of course be limited to the very early tiers, preventing more modern tanks from using these maps' small sizes where their faster speeds and longer ranged guns would quickly ensure that balance would be completely broken. Another disadvantage is that Gaijin simply may not feel the need to introduce earlier tanks, as they may prefer to focus on more modern tanks. I do see this point of view and I suspect this may be the case at the moment, as of course more modern tanks will sell for higher prices and be more popular among players, thus making Gaijin more money. However, as time goes on and the number of modern tanks available to be added decreases, Gaijin will have less and less options on what tanks they can feasibly add, with World War I tanks thus becoming a more tempting option as time goes on. In addition, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there aren't many, if any, games that cater to people who would like to play World War I tanks. So by introducing these tanks, Gaijin could quickly corner this market. Albeit this market would be smaller than that of modern tanks, but one that could prove lucrative if fans of this era find War Thunder the best place to play these tanks. One last benefit is with regards to vehicles that are already in the game, such as the Japanese Type 95 Hargo and the French FCM 36, with both tanks being considered very good modern tanks when introduced into service in real life, but unfortunately don't perform very well in game, to the point that you are now prevented from unlocking these vehicles when you first start on those nations' tech trees. So having earlier tanks that they could fight against could allow these vehicles to actually stand half a chance of doing well in War Thunder. So overall, while I think the introduction of World War I tanks would pose some challenges, I believe these problems could be overcome, and if done so correctly, could give Gaijin a new market and new target audience to draw into War Thunder, which could be a great benefit for the players and the game as a whole. But I'd be interested in your thoughts. Do you think World War I tanks would be a good addition to War Thunder? If so, what tanks would you be looking forward to seeing? And if you don't think they'd be a good fit and shouldn't be added to the game, I'd be interested to hear your reasons why. I look forward to reading your comments below. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. Hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.